Hello, Burnsville, and welcome to our Economic Development Commission meeting for Wednesday, May the 8th, 2019. And to begin, I would like to start with adoption of the agenda. It looks like we have some housekeeping before we get into updates. Review of the public improvement fees, led by Jessica Cook with Elders. Thank you for coming. Review of the land to sell to Interstate Development Corporation, Economic Development Strategic Plan updates, and then a review on the creation of Tax Increment District Number 9. Any motion to accept the agenda as stated?
So moved.
It is moved.
I'll second.
And second. Any room for discussion? Hearing none, we'll put it to a vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
I think that was unanimous. All right, second, approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which was January 9, 2019. They were included in our packets. Anyone have any adjustments or anything to bring up? Can we approve those minutes?
I'll move.
It's been moved
Second.
and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Didn't think so. Well, that brings us to item number 3. That's our update with Mr. Ninehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one update. On behalf of the city of Burnsville, we would like to thank Commissioners Cherner, John, and DePaul. Commissioners Cherner and John are actually coming to the end of their second term, so they've spent 6 years with us. And as you know, that after two terms, you need to move on. And Commissioner DePaul is moving, so he will be stepping down also. But on behalf of the city, we appreciate the time and effort that you've given us and wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you.
That's it for updates, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Well, then we'll move into a review of a PIF, which is the public improvement fees. In with Elders, Jessica Cook has stopped by to give us a presentation on that. So I'll hand the floor over to you, Jessica, whenever you're ready.
Good evening. I'm with Elders, and I work with Stacy and Jason, who were unavailable to be here this evening, but I'm happy to be here, and we'll try and make your last meeting go out with a bang. So,
Nice.
like every field, we like acronyms. And so PIF is another one that stands for Public Improvement Fees. And it came up, the idea of using the public improvement fees came up, of course, in the context of talking about the redevelopment at Burnsville Center in particular, but also areas around Burnsville Center. And it was something that was in the visioning document that Damon Farber prepared. So we wanted to address that. So the first thing I wanted to just talk about is what is a PIF, or a public improvement fee. It's something that is used in other states because it's not actually authorized under state law here in Minnesota, at least not yet. And it looks and feels and smells like a sales tax to the person paying it, which is the person buying something at a retail establishment. But actually what it is it's a private fee that's collected by a private entity to be used to benefit that entity for some sort of public or private use. So if you had, let's take a mall as an example, and let's take an easier example than Burnsville Center and say that the mall has one owner. That owner would file a covenant against the property whereby anyone who owned that property going forward would need to collect a fee that would be established in a designated amount, and for ease, let's say it's 1%. And then every retail lease, every lessee, is that right, lessor in that property, would then be beholden to collect that fee on behalf of the owner of the retail entity and remit it to usually a third-party entity, corporation, that's tasked with collecting that fee and then using it to pay for improvements. So from a user's experience, the shopper at the mall, they just paid an additional sales tax. But it isn't a tax in the sense that it's not imposed by the unit of local government, although there is approval of local government for this. It's not collected by local government, and most importantly, local government isn't determining what it's going to be used for. So the way it works is that, as I mentioned, is added to the cost of the goods sold at the retail establishment, and I have a couple of examples here on the screen. If somebody bought on the left here $43 of shoes and clothing, and it was a 1.4% public improvement fee, they would then pay 60 cents for a total purchase of $43.60. Then, at least the way it works in Colorado, which is the state that uses this the most, they would pay a sales tax on all of that. So you're paying the sales tax on the fee for a total purchase of $46.87. So, and then the example on the right is just a non-taxable item, but it essentially works the same way. So then the question is, why is this financing mechanism? So the other thing I should have mentioned about it is that this revenue, of course, comes in over time, slowly as items are sold at the retail establishment, but somebody wants to use it to pay for improvements up front. So in states where this is a more established mechanism, there are lenders that will finance an improvement up front to be repaid over time by the collection of these fees. Whether you find a lender in this market that would do that for a untested collection system, I think is a question that we would have to explore if the city wanted to pursue this. The other option, of course, would be that the city could finance the improvement and take the risk of the fee revenue coming in and pay itself back, which, of course, is also not yet authorized under state law. So, something to consider. So why was this recommended? I think it was recommended because it was familiar to the planners. And it was a tool that they were used to, and they weren't as well versed with the tools that we do already have available in Minnesota. So what happens in Colorado is the local government is much more dependent on sales tax than Minnesota local government is pretty property tax dependent. And you may have heard of TABOR, or the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, that got passed a few years ago in Colorado, where it became very difficult for local governments to raise any form of taxes, property taxes or sales taxes, without a referendum. And so it really tied their hands on being able to use taxes for economic development activities. Because a public improvement fee is not a local sales tax, there is the ability for private entities to impose that fee with local government permission and raise revenue without having to have a referendum. So that's the appeal of it in a state like Colorado as a referendum avoidance tool. In order to get around the issue that sometimes, so what happened before is there might have been an increase in the local sales tax to help a situation like Burnsville Center. Since that's no longer allowable without a referendum, sometimes the city will allow the developer to put the PIF in place and then lower their sales tax so that it's a net equal to somebody making a purchase there. But it's a way of getting revenue to the developer in a legal way. So that's why they're used in Colorado, and there also something similar to it is used in Florida, and those are the two situations that I'm familiar with. I hope this can be interactive, so please, if you have comments or questions, let me know. So the revenues that are collected from this tool can be used in other states for public improvements, such as streets and sidewalks, demolition, utilities, stormwater improvements. They can also be used for private improvements, such as architectural upgrades, common areas, parking facilities, etc. So in Colorado, where this model came from, it's a very flexible tool. I mentioned some of the drawbacks that we talked about at Ellers when we were discussing this idea. And I think first and foremost is that it's not permitted under state law at this point in time, so it would necessitate special legislation. Well, it could be special legislation specific to Burnsville, but that might trigger a statewide conversation about whether it should be generally authorized across the state. So it would probably be an uphill conversation at the legislature to prove why we would need it in the face of what I would anticipate would be opposition from retailers on this on a statewide level. That's a little bit of editorializing on my part. Yeah,
So nowhere in the state is this allowed? We're in
Right.
Minnesota right now, okay.
yep. I mentioned that retailers might be opposed to it, and that's because, you know, they're already struggling, the brick and mortar retailers are struggling with the internet competition, and the internet competition not always having to pay sales tax. And so this sort of doubles down on that disparity, where in addition to the statewide sales tax, there would be a local PIF that would be charged on the goods and services in their stores. So it would put them at a competitive disadvantage. Specific to Burnsville Center, you have the 3 owners, and so there'd have to be coordination there. And you would need to establish who's going to be doing the collection and the enforcement, who will be that entity. And would the city or the EDC want to step into that role? Or would you want to do the Colorado model and have more, set up some sort of private corporate entity for that purpose? Another issue that we thought might be a problem as we talked about this is the fact that you have all these existing tenants in the mall. And every time they go to print out a receipt, you know, it has the price and the sales tax on it. And now they would have to somehow figure out new software for their system, so it would have the price and then the PIF and then the sales tax. And that could be an expensive burden on those retailers to itemize that. There's also nothing in their leases right now that requires them to do that. So you could have a covenant against the land, but they rent, they don't own the land. So what is that mechanism to get your lessors, if I get that right, to implement it on behalf of the owners of the mall? And would there need to be some lease concessions to do that, which sort of defeats the purpose, because then you're reducing your rental revenue. So that's a potential issue, that the whole implementation at the retailer level. And then what I alluded to before, you know, we want something, we want cash up front to make improvements today or in the near future, and then we'd need to finance those and recover those costs over time. And is a public improvement fee a secure enough funding mechanism that somebody would make a loan against that? And I think that that's untested about who that would be and what the terms of that loan would be. And of course, the cheapest financing is if the local unit of government can provide the financing because of the financing tools you currently have at your disposal. This model, as it's used in Colorado, usually uses a private lender at the private cost of funds. Yeah.
So who would be in control of the money? It would be the equity firm that you put together, or the firm that you put together to collect the funds? Is it more on the retailer's end to have the money, or to the city's end to have the money?
I think there, you know, because you would need special legislation, there'd be the ability to craft some of that. I think the way it works in Colorado is that it's determined, the amount and the uses, and that gets recorded in the covenant against the property. So it's secured against the property. The corporation is basically, earns a fee for managing that and passing that through to the lender, and then there would be terms in the loan that would limit what it could have been spent on and recover from. So your accountability mechanisms would be the covenant against the land, the loan agreement, the financing agreements, and the, what that collecting entity,
Right.
what their charge is. What I don't know as much about is there is approval by the local government entity, but I'm not sure how much say the local government entity gets in the use of it and for what period of time. But as I said, in Minnesota, because we need special legislation, you could craft it in such a way that there was more local control.
So if I'm a business owner or the owner of the mall, wouldn't it be easier just to charge more rent than to go through this larger cycle of things? To make the
I
improvement?
think so.
I mean, I guess that's where my confusion is coming, but evidently it's something they do, so. Yeah, I guess that's my question.
Right, I mean, if they charge more rent, that, the retailer has to pay the rent regardless of how much they sell.
Right,
If it's like a sales tax, it's sales dependent, and the retailer may be able to share some of the cost of that with the customers. So from the retailer's perspective, they may prefer it as an additional tax, even though it puts them as a disadvantage. There may be some cost sharing with the customers. And if they don't sell as much, at least it's not a fixed cost.
okay, I can see that.
So one of the advantages, because we did try and think of some advantages, is that it's very flexible. And a lot of the tools we do have in Minnesota, which I'll talk about in a minute, are really directed towards public costs or narrowly defined private costs. And the public improvement fees can really be used for anything that's agreed upon up front, as I understand it. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about is what some of the alternatives are that we already have available in state statute. And I won't go into a lot of detail unless you'd like me to on any of these. But I'll give a very brief description. So TIF, I think you're all familiar with. That's capturing the taxes from the growth in value of a development. Have you done tax abatement?
Yes.
Okay, so tax abatement is done by the city, the county, and the school district with separate approvals. So that's one of the big differences between tax abatement and TIF. There are special service districts, and special service districts are authorized under state law for a part of your city that is receiving a higher level of service than is generally provided to another part of the city. And for that higher level of service, you can charge a fee. So a good example would be you have a downtown, you're putting up the lamp posts with the decorative banners, you're maintaining flower pots, you put in the cobblestone walkways, you're street sweeping every month instead of twice a year. So that downtown is getting a higher level of service, and you can charge a fee to recover the cost of delivering that higher level of service. There is a petition process, so the property owners in the area have to petition for that and agree to it, so much as they would a PIF. But that mechanism is available right now. There's bonds. There's special assessments, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And then if you're going for special legislation, you could go for a local sales tax, which would be community-wide versus focusing on a particular retail district and pitting some of your retail districts in your community with a higher fee or tax against other areas of the community. So those are all mechanisms that can be used to pay for public improvements. And then TIF and tax abatement can also be used for site preparation, demolition, some parking. So there's small incursions into private improvements there, but mostly public improvements. If we're looking for ways to pay for common area improvements within the mall, which is essentially private space, although it certainly functions as a public space, there's private equity and debt. There are common area maintenance charges that can be passed through to tenants. And there's the lease revenues, which is what you had mentioned. So part of the trick in forming a public-private partnership with the mall owners is to identify those public costs that you can help with that will free up their capital for them to pay for the private costs. So that's the end of my presentation. I was involved in the Southdale redevelopment, and I did the TIF district for that. So if you have any specific questions about that, I'm also happy to answer those.
Well, I would, which tool would you most recommend for us to use in this city center? Or the,
Well, I think that I was going to use the word quest. I'm not sure that's the right word, but the request that you have to the legislature for a TIF district that is more flexible than the current TIF law would be an excellent tool.
okay.
Because it's long-term, it's flexible, it's tried and true in terms of getting financing for TIF revenues. So I think that's very worthwhile. I think, the Special Service District has some interesting ideas, but is really more towards maybe maintaining the improvements rather than financing the improvements. And special assessments are great because they're the most secure, from the city's point of view, it's a very low-risk form of financing.
And what was used for the Southdale project? Was it just TIF?
That was TIF. That was right after the recession, so there was a special law that allowed TIF to be used for private costs that right now we can't use it for. So TIF actually was used for remodeling bathrooms and, doing some other things like that. But it was structured as a loan. And so the city provided a loan and then repaid itself from tax increment. So I think it took a loan from some funds it had from another TIF district and then used the TIF from the mall to pay itself back.
So to be clear on that, Eric, did you?
There you can go.
Okay, to be clear on that, a few questions around that. So the advantage of the Public Improvement Fund is allows the developers, the owners, to actually go in and do improvements to the center, for instance, that aren't necessarily public, municipal, maintained by the public entity, which TIF allows for, or tax abatement allows for. So I understand that, but we haven't done it in Minnesota, so today it's really not a tool. The TIF that you just talked about for Southdale and the vehicle to convert it to a loan, that tool does no longer exist, correct?
The ability to use TIF and to convert it to a loan exists, but the ability, the kinds of expenditures that the mall used it for are no longer authorized, because that was a window of opportunity that was related to the recession. But for example, in the Southdale example, it could have been structured in a way that the TIF was used to, they actually shrank their retail footprint in the mall, and they tore down some space. And so, you know, the TIF wasn't used for that demolition, but it could have been, thereby freeing up the private funds to pay for the bathrooms and the lighting and some of the other improvements that the TIF paid for.
But you're saying that vehicle no longer exists because of some changes.
Right.
So, to me, it's kind of a math problem. How much money do they need to reposition that asset? And if TIF accomplishes that, there's already some precedents in place, and I think it's a great tool because they win and the public wins as value is created and so forth. But if we are saying that that's not enough from a math problem and we need to look at layering something like this public improvement fees, is that why that's being discussed? That potentially it would be another layer that would allow that opportunity to raise more money than what is needed through TIF?
They could be used together, presumably, assuming that the special legislation permitted that. I don't see why they couldn't. Yeah.
And so somebody should do that math. I'd be curious to see what that math looks like, to see really what it achieves through TIF versus what we think we need to achieve and what that all looks like. And then the last question I have, and then I'll turn over the mic, is I don't like it when we have special taxes without a sunset. And so, to me, to come up with a PIF, I don't think passing it on to the tenants and higher rent is an answer, because ultimately the market's going to get what the market gets, and now you just penalize the Burnsville Center compared to other competing products. But if the city were to do a tax abatement on top of that for the incrementals, essentially the same amount that's being raised through the PIF, then potentially that all kind of makes sense, because at the end of the day, the tenants aren't paying more and the consumer's not paying more. But can you put a sunset to that, so eventually once you raise the funds, that goes away?
To the PIF?
Yes.
I think so. Yeah. I can verify that.
Be curious.
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Sure.
Just a point of clarification. If the special TIF legislation passes and we utilize TIF at the Burnsville Center, we cannot do tax abatement on top of TIF. You cannot do an abatement inside of a TIF district.
That was my question. So we're pursuing a TIF for that Center Village, the Burnsville Center, right?
Correct. And Ms. Dean is actually actively working on that.
And his question, do either one of you know what percent it would be covered by TIF? It would be fully funded if we did get the TIF the way it's currently being positioned with the legislature?
So the area covered would be the Burnsville Center proper, and then some of the outlying properties we're asking for north of County Road 42, the right-of-way within that area and the properties that touch it. As far as, that would be the defined area, so anything within that area could be eligible for TIF funds. Of course, public improvement related. About PIF, just to go back a little bit, that was analyzed as just another tool in the toolbox, not that we saw that there was a gap in funding, but it was just an option, another tool to potentially use and access. So that's part of the reason that was explored further as well.
So there is a gap in the funding.
Not that I'm aware of, no. It's just, we're looking at what tools do we have available currently today, and then what other options are out there, what are other states using.
So you think the TIF, if it got approved, would be adequate for funding this current plan?
Public improvements within the area, and there are other options to use to kind of piggyback on that, to look at, are there other grants available? Are there other loans available? It's just that we have multiple tools that we can use. And there's not necessarily, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a gap, however.
It's basically just addressing the concern we had with not knowing all the tools in our toolbox before, and you're just presenting these different tools, correct?
Other ideas,
Other
correct.
ideas, yeah. Any other questions?
So do we need a decision if we want to promote this PIF or if we don't? Is that kind of what we're looking for?
What do you recommend?
Yes, we would be looking for a recommendation from the EDC.
My personal opinion would be totally against it. As a retailer, I don't know if you know how the software works, but it's very difficult to even add a sales tax onto something, or an individual, a city one or a county one or whatever, he has to go through all these different steps. And to add something like this, that's not even a sales tax, into a software, we're talking a major expense for some of these retailers to do that. And I just think it would put an unnecessary burden on the retailers in the area. It wouldn't be a fair thing to do. That's my personal opinion.
Well, I think it's
Commissioner
I'm not that thrilled with it either, mostly because it's a big legal lift. I mean, to get it through state legislature and us Burnsville saying, hey, this is what we need, and there'll be an army of people against that. And I'm just going, wow. Inventing, and it quacks like a duck, it looks like a duck, but it isn't a duck. I mean, but it's not tax.
It's a fee.
Yeah, that's right. So,
Yeah, I think all the cons that have been laid out outweigh the pros by far, and when you include the spending the political capital on this, it just doesn't seem to justify the ends.
Anybody else have comments?
I do like the flexibility, though, it allows the owner of the property that the TIF does not do. But it'd be interesting to see if we could now combine it with another tool that allows the owners to come up with some money on top of the TIF to improve the property itself, other than the PIF, that maybe we could explore.
I'm kind of pushing this out, and we're supposed to talk about PIFs, but can you layer on like grants or other type of financing on top of the TIF if that's approved?
Absolutely, Commissioner.
Okay, any other discussion on this? So we're looking for a recommendation whether to or not recommend this going up to the city council, or the city council utilizing a PIF. So do I have a motion?
I would make a motion that we do not recommend using a PIP in anywhere in Burnsville for anything.
Okay, sounds very strong, very strong. Any
Not today.
any seconds to Commissioner Coppin's motion?
I second it.
Okay. Any discussion on the motion or second? Hearing none, I'm going to put to a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone disapprove? Ayes have it. Thank you so much for presenting today.
Appreciate it.
Next, we're going to talk about land sale to Interstate Development Corporation. Looks like we're trying to get a good caribou in at 42 in Newton. Presenting is our Economic Development
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Coordinator.
The land in question is located at County Road 42 in Newton. For just kind of geographic perspective, it basically sits next to Rose Park, which is where the soccer fields are on County Road 42. It is literally a hill, and it slopes drastically down towards those soccer fields. We have had a sign on the property for at least 10 years, having it for sale. And as I noted in your backgrounds, we've gone through a number of different renditions where we've had maybe some opportunities, but they really haven't come forth. We were approached by Interstate Development to purchase the property. They are representing Caribou Coffee. Caribou Coffee has a new concept, which is a drive-through only. Because of that, they obviously do not need a large parcel of ground, so they can utilize that piece of parcel without totally taking care of the whole hill. They will have to do some site prep work. This is a new concept. It is my understanding that there will be about 5 of these within the next year in the Twin Cities. So we would have one of the first ones that would go up. To give you a little idea of what it's going to look like, this is how the structure would be on the parcel and the queuing up. Planning has reviewed this. There's enough queuing for the cars, so we do think it will work. There will be a little outside patio. And first question is, why would you have an outside patio? Because it's a drive-through only. Interestingly enough, the city and the county is working on a large bike trail through the area, so we are encouraging Interstate to actually have a sidewalk to hook up to the bike trail, so the bikers can come down, sit on the patio, enjoy their coffee. as the Center Village, plan unveils, we anticipate more bikers and things like that within that area, more residents within that area. So this may be something they would bike to and sit on the patio, and have their coffee. The building itself is gonna be, about 550 square feet. The purchase price, is at the appraised price of $65,000. It was appraised in February of this year. The agreement will call for them to close on the property by the end of November, to commence construction by the beginning of January, and to complete construction by the end of next year. My guess is they will actually commence construction almost as soon as they can close and get going. Those dates were basically put into the contract to give them some leeway. Staff is recommending that the EDA recommend to the EDA that they sell the land to Interstate Development for this project, and I would certainly stand for any questions, Mr. Chair.
I was gonna ask, is there any additional funding that the city is going to have to put up for renovation of the land? Or
No, Mr. Chair. The developer, that will be their cost, and we are estimating somewhere between $300,000 and $350,000 of development costs just to get to the point that they can start building the structure.
Okay.
And the roadway, is that, they're gonna own the roadway, is that private, or are we gonna own the asphalt?
Newton Avenue already exists, and
I'm
that's,
talking about the driveway you've got there.
that's the queue for the cars to come in.
So
That's on their property.
Their property?
Yeah.
Okay. So it'll come right off Newton there and just curve around?
Correct, Commissioner.
And traffic flow, it's not an issue on Newton?
No, absolutely not. There's virtually no traffic on Newton.
I didn't think so.
Is there a walk-up window? I'm looking at these pictures and it looks like there's a drive-through window. and maybe a
Commissioner, I
walk-up window.
believe there is a walk-up window, yes.
I'm curious, in a building where you just have drive-through, would they have to provide bathrooms for the public?
Correct, Commissioner,
They do?
yes.
Okay.
500.
When are we assuming this bike path would be going through there? Would it be in 2020?
Commissioner, I do not know, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
I don't know if Ms. Dean,
I'm sorry, I don't know either. We can follow up with you if you'd like.
Sure. Personally, I think this is a great win for the city and for the builder and everything. Anybody else have any comments, questions?
No, I think it's a great utilization of the land where it is. It's been sitting vacant for a long time. I was looking the other night and there's no caribou copies within that area. There's one 10 miles west in Savage. There's one in the mall, but the mall doesn't open until after traffic or the rush hour rush. There's a Starbucks down the road, so I mean, it's a big win for caribou and big win for the city and the developer to, utilize this space.
Plus, it's a different model altogether. It wouldn't be a sit-down caribou, so it would be a different model, so no real competition there either.
Yeah, I think the pedestrian and biker, access makes it a win for me. So.
Anybody else? Well, we need to make a recommendation to the city council whether to move forward with this or not. Does anybody have a motion to make?
I'll make a motion to approve it.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion to approve and second. Any comments, questions, concerns before we move to a vote? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? It is unanimous. I believe we're moving on to updates. The development strategic plan, economic development strategic plan updates. Again, Mr. Ninehouse.
thank you, Mr. Chair. As you all know, since you were intimately involved in it, we developed an economic development strategic plan that was approved by council in November of last year. On your work plan this year, we have promised that we would make updates at each of your meetings. Since you did not meet in March, we actually emailed all of you an update. So our update that you got in your background basically covers the past 2 months. Just a couple of highlights. We did receive what is referred to as a host community grant from DEED for $415,000. That will be put towards a traffic study on County Road 42, a sanitary sewer model study across the whole city, and some improvements to 121st and Pleasant, which is the road down by the Dodge dealership that leads to what used to be our archery range, which is now an expansion of Dodge, which has been in disrepair for years. We did go out with an RFQ to hire a branding and marketing firm. We have hired that. It's a firm called AE2S Communications. Staff has met with them to get them going, and they will actually be in front of council next Tuesday night at a work session to give council kind of an idea of what their process is going forward. The goal is to have a brand ready to go by fire muster in September for the unveiling. And then by the end of the year, we will have a complete marketing and communications plan put together with AE2S. Just to give you an idea, over the last 2 months, various members of the community development staff have met with 50 developers, business owners, building owners, in different kinds of meetings. What you see and what council sees is typically the finalization of meetings, but there are typically a lot of meetings that in some cases actually go nowhere, or in other cases, it's a long ongoing process until it gets to you. The city manager, myself, and our lobbyist did meet with both of the Senate and House legislative chairs regarding the host grant, because every biennium, the host grant has to be renewed. It is currently in both the House and the Senate bills as they move forward, so we are anticipating that we will keep that grant. The mayor and city manager also testified regarding the special TIF legislation that was discussed for the Burnsville Center, and we are monitoring that as it moves forward for the last couple of weeks. We also formed what we are loosely calling a partners group, which is the city, the Chamber of Commerce, the Convention Bureau, and School District 191. They will meet on a quarterly basis, and basically the idea is to talk about how those four entities can work better together to market the city. And this is kind of an offshoot of the branding and marketing that we're going to be doing. And our next meeting in June, we'll actually have AE2S address them as one of the focus groups. I think you all got an email from our new community development assistant, Beth Weber. Beth came on board about a month and a half ago. Beth kind of replaced Sarah Arnold, our planning assistant, when Sarah became the planner and when Ms. Dean became our redevelopment coordinator. But Beth actually now is providing assistance to both planning and economic development, whereas in the past, we just had the planning assistant. And then I think you also, via Ms. Weber, got an email about the new redevelopment button on our website. That was through the efforts of our planners, Ms. Dean, and our new GIS coordinator to put that button on there, which for the public's view, you can go to that button now, click on the button, and you can look up any project that's either ongoing or going through the process of approval. So it's really just our way of letting people know what's going on in the city of Burnsville. We need no recommendation. That is an update, but I would certainly stand if you had any questions on any of the other items that were in your background.
Any questions from anyone? I'd have to say that I like the button idea. That's really cool to be able to see those things up front. That's a great idea, and I like the work with the ISD 191. And these are all great things that are going on. I'm very impressed with the direction the city has been heading.
Well, those are actually based on the input that this group and our EDA gave us during our strategic plan development.
So it's kind of biased compliments, but we'll take it. And finally, I think we're looking at adding a new TIF district.
That is correct, Mr. Chair. The district in question is land up on River Ridge Circle. It is 2 parcels. For historical perspective, this is the land that at one time had the Fanta Suite hotels. When that hotel was built, the purchaser of that hotel was looking to renovate it. Quickly found out that the renovation costs were going to exceed the value of the hotel, so they tore down the hotel. He also was very involved in the building of hotels in the Dakotas during the great big oil boom in the Dakotas. That kind of took his emphasis away from Burnsville. He built all these hotels and everything else and has basically done nothing on the property. local developer has purchased the property, is proposing a 81,000 square foot office warehouse building. He would combine the two parcels to build that building. He is looking at probably somewhere between 24 and 28 ceiling height, which, as you know, we've discussed before, is a ceiling height that we do not have in the Burnsville marketplace, or we have on a very limited basis. Right now, it will be a spec building, but his intent is to target, high-tech medical manufacturing, that sort of tenant for it. It would be an economic development district, which has a 9-year life. Ellers has estimated that there would be $247,000 worth of TIF available. Again, as you are all aware, we are on a pay-go system, so that TIF would be paid out over those 9 years as the owner of the property made those tax payments. The agreement would be structured that the TIF would pay for the additional earthwork and retaining walls that is needed to be able to construct the 81,000 square foot building. It is estimated, the developer is telling us, without all of that earthwork, he's probably looking at about a 40,000 square foot building, which he does not want to do. So should that work be less than the $247,000, that's what the developer would receive. He will not actually profit from this. This gives you a little idea of the proposed layout on the site. You can see it is going to be quite a large building. Again, our planning department has reviewed this site and has given a couple of suggestions back to the developer, but it looks like a very workable site for the project. Staff would be recommending that the EDC recommend, the EDA, not the EDC, create TIF District number 9, and I would certainly stand for any questions.
Any questions from anyone?
I guess what is the process to get the TIF implemented in this project?
To create the district, basically, there is a document that is created, and we have Ellers working on that. There will be a public hearing. We are right now scheduled for that public hearing to be on June 18th. So anyone can come and speak about the creation of the district. We also, at the same time, are creating a purchase and development agreement with the developer that spells out the construction, the TIF, the completion dates, all those sorts of things that are in your background. So there's really going to be 2 documents that we will be looking at between now and June 18th. Once it's created, he goes about and does his project, and then as the taxes are paid, we give him the increment that is available to him.
Thanks.
So was this area originally zoned for hotel and amenities, or was there any zoning? 'Cause it's being
The
characterized now
zoning,
as-
correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Dean, but I believe the zoning is either B3 or B4.
Yeah, I think it's zone B3, so it does allow for a variety of uses for commercial, office,
So it's,
hotel. There's a whole list of different types of uses you could do in that zoning district. It is pretty
so it's
flexible.
not out of characteristic in that local area to have a warehouse. kind of environment.
It's an allowed use.
Has there been any sort of estimate as far as what the projected property tax difference would be in a 40,000 versus 81,000 square foot building?
We did not do that projection, Commissioner.
Is there a formula to determine how many parking places are needed? For the size of that building, it didn't look like there was enough.
Yes, we, in our zoning district, we have a parking calculation that planning will run through.
Okay.
And I believe initially there were enough parking spaces.
When the developer initially came in, their intent was to build a building that met all of zoning codes, so setbacks, green space, parking, exterior materials, height of the building, and whatnot. So I don't know where they are in the process, if they're asking for any deviations at this point, but when they initially came in, they were hoping to meet all of our zoning codes.
Now, I was gonna look at the land and I've keep passing by, but don't think to look over there. What kind of, it talked about a retaining wall, or looking at it on Google, I couldn't really see there a need for any kind of changes to the land, but just curious on.
It is my understanding, Mr. Chair, that there is some sloping to the land that would have to be leveled out and dealt with in order to get that size building. And again, they're gonna have to combine the two parcels and replat to be able to do that size building.
Because this is doubling the size of the building almost, correct?
Correct.
So I have a few thoughts on that, if I could share them. I'm very familiar with this site. I believe this site today holds a building that's closer to 55 to 60,000 square feet. And so any TIF that would be on there, I think, should be tied only to the additional expansion of going beyond whatever the site will accommodate today, and I think we could quantify that pretty quickly with an architect. That would be my first thought on that. The second thought is that this is a premier site. It sits up high. It's a gateway site, in my opinion, to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area as you cross the river. It is definitely a site that is going to stand out to Burnsville and set a statement for Burnsville. The developer historically is an industrial developer that develops 24, 28-foot bulk industrial buildings. And not that I'm opposed to that use, but it needs to be different than a traditional industrial building, in my opinion. It needs to have a glass ribbon front to it, and it needs to present a very good image to the 35W pedestrians who pass by that site and see that on behalf of Burnsville. I think it would be a shame if we allowed a traditional industrial building to be at that site. I like the use, I like the jobs it creates, but I think it needs to be a much higher end, better developed building than a historic industrial building.
That is a very good point.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at the neighborhood, because I know that is a premier site. On the sight lines coming into Burnsville, that is clearly an identifiable space.
It is also in the way of the new event center that we've approved. That's going to be views that will overlook that area. So I'm not opposed to an industrial building there, 24, 28 foot, but I think we need to require some additional improvements on that side, the 35W side at least. That would be different than a traditional industrial building, but in line with a high-tech building. That's my 2 cents on that.
Do we know what the height differential is between this proposal and the adjacent building that's already there?
There are no buildings in the area that would be taller than this building that I am aware of.
No, this is just a strip mall here.
And most of the buildings in the surrounding area are, my guess, Commissioner, are somewhere in the 25 to 30-year-old buildings.
So, Chair, if I just might add something from a planning and zoning perspective. So when the planners look through the proposal, they'll be looking at what does our zoning code allow. And if the developer doesn't ask for any waivers or deviations from the city's zoning code, city staff doesn't have the flexibility to say, we want this to be all brick and glass. If we have a list of materials that says you can do 50 different materials, and the developer chooses to do any one of those materials or mix of those materials, they can do whatever we want. So from a planning and zoning standpoint, as long as they meet city code, we don't have a whole lot to say about how the proposal looks, again, from a planning and zoning standpoint. So yes, it might be a premier site. Yes, it might be a gateway to Burnsville, but that flexibility and creativity is left up to the architect and the applicant, again, to what's allowed in our city code as well, to use that as a framework for what they propose in front of us.
As a stipulation to the TIF district, could we add that in there, or is that going too far? Is that?
If I could, Mr. Chair, building materials are not eligible expenses in a TIF district.
Okay.
It's site work, prep work, that sort of thing. So to call out for that in the creation of the TIF district would not be something that staff would be looking to have done.
Okay.
From my perspective, I'm familiar with the area too. I don't think that that's going to be the visual aspect is gonna be such a big issue because when you're coming, especially when you're coming from the south, it's just on the other side of the Highway 13 bridge, so I think your view of that building would be blocked until after you come up from the bridge, and then it comes and goes pretty quickly. So that doesn't worry me as much. I'm fine with the use, the warehouse. I guess my concern is whether it's financially worth it for the city to do a TIF if we haven't done sort of the cost benefit analysis, if they're gonna do a 41 or a 40,000 foot warehouse anyway, without the TIF.
If I could, Mr. Commissioner, if that's what you took from my comment, I misspoke. The developer has told me that if the TIF district is not created, they will put the land back up for sale. They have no intention of building a 40,000 square foot building.
How long has it been for sale?
Oh, 10
5
years
years.
or more?
And how many new jobs would this expect to create?
We are asking for, in the agreement, 20 new jobs. Because this is a spec building, it's a little hard to come up with the exact number of jobs. So we are saying at least 20 jobs at least a $25 an hour rate.
Any other questions or comments? This is one we're gonna have to make a recommendation to the EDA to create the TIF district. Any recommendations to be made? We're all thinking, that's fine.
Well, I mean, just maybe some more discussion on, things I'm thinking through is the trade-off. If you don't do the TIF, then you've got a willing developer walking away. There's a couple of consequences. One is, it's a dead space of land that hasn't, it's a high-profile space, I agree. It's not the highest profile space, so it's not the wedding dress or anything like that we're messing with here. And secondly, it's a good thing to have a reputation in Burnsville as cooperative with developers, so I don't want to be too like, oh, no, it doesn't meet our high standards, but I think, given a TIF, that would help. Do you have a feel for what the break even, how many years it would take to recover, that TIF based on his design and his expectations?
Well, the Economic Development District, Mr. Commissioner, is 9 years. So the payout would be over 9 years.
Over 9 years, all right. So-
And as was pointed out in your background, the request does meet the parameters of our business subsidy policy for the creation of a TIF district.
Which are what?
It's adding tax jobs, it's redevelopment. It's basically taking an area that has nothing on it and creating something.
And staff recommends this?
That's correct, Mr. Commissioner. We are recommending that you recommend that the EDA create the district.
The big positive on this is it's gonna bring in a warehouse, with the dimensions that we are looking for in that area. And you wanted to say something?
So just point of clarification. First of all, the site, just to clarify, has not been for sale for 10 years. It was sold by a hotel developer that was going to redevelop, and then, as was shared, it was not, they did not go ahead with it. And it's been on the market the last few years at a pretty high price. And with the recovery of the industrial markets, a very desirable location at the right price. So just to be clear on that. Second of all is that, am I hearing you say that as the EDC, we have no ability to make sure that the building is built in a way that's a little bit above standard from a traditional industrial building? And there's nothing we can do about that. The only thing that we can really talk about is, do we approve the TIF or not approve the TIF?
That would be
We
correct,
can't
Commissioner.
even stipulate the percentage of TIF based upon the incremental gain.
Well, the answer to the first part of your question is, the building material aspects of the building is the purview of the planning commission. not the Economic Development Commission. The Economic Development Commission can certainly recommend that if we create the district, that there be less than the TIF that is available that will be given to the developer. You can certainly make that recommendation, yes.
So can the planning commission, can they put some stipulations on the type of building or design?
Yes, their stipulation is that it will need to meet, as Ms. Dean has already stated, will need to meet our zoning and ordinances.
Right, which she stated they have.
From the early meetings that we've had with the developer, their intent is to meet all of our zoning codes. Now, it's been a couple months since I've had, personal contact with the applicant, and things, may have changed. But it's my understanding that again, their intent is to meet all of our codes, exterior materials, green space, setbacks, height, things like that,
And
use.
I believe what Commissioner LaFever is asking is that there be a request that they go above and beyond that. That is not something that we can do.
We can only do that if they're asking for any deviations from code. If they're coming in with a straight project that
Fair
meets
enough.
all of
Yep.
requirements, then we have an obligation to approve their project. We meaning ultimately city council.
If we establish this TIF district and this particular developer doesn't do what he says he's going to do, and he sells the land, does the TIF stay?
Yes,
Okay.
but the amount would then be dependent on whatever the increment is for whatever gets built there.
Okay.
But we have, Commissioner, we have gotten no indications from the developer that if the district is created, that they won't build the building. They have stipulated that if the district is not created, they will put the land back for sale.
So it seems to me we have a bird in the hand, we have a land for sale that is a huge lot and would be a huge building. It would bring economy, it would bring jobs, it would bring, to the only negative is that it might not be pretty right in that spot, which is a high visible spot, I agree. But I would have to say, I think I would lean more towards doing the TIF than not, for just that reason.
Yeah, I'm in a similar position. It's 6-4. I'm kind of in favor of doing it, but there's some reservations. If we could communicate that to the planning commission and have some sort of notation or some general commentary, 'cause not legally, I know it's not binding, but it would certainly help maybe encourage them. But nowadays, some of these even industrial developments, the new materials they're using look a lot better than they did 20 years ago. Some of the stuff I'm seeing in Apple Valley and the other areas, I go, wow. I mean, it's not an eyesore at all. So my hope is that that's what they use, some more contemporary materials and a little interesting design, so.
I think one of my concerns is we're already considering TIFs for the Burnsville Center as that being a potential use for the future, and I would see that being pretty substantial use of the TIF. So I just hesitate to create another TIF district for this purpose when this land could potentially be viable without it. So I'm hesitant, and I guess right now I'm leaning towards no versus yes, so.
Is there any limit to the amount of TIFs? I think I've asked this before. TIFs, no, okay.
No, there is not. There is not. And one TIF district does not affect another TIF district.
Does anybody have any kind of motion they'd like to bring forward? Seems like a lot of us are on the fence on this.
I'm, just a point of clarification, I still didn't quite understand, could we tie TIF just to the incremental gain?
That's exactly what
In
it's-
building size versus the entire, so in other words, if the parcel today supports a 55 or 60,000 square foot building versus, 40,000, which again, we could quantify. And so to gain the additional 20,000 square feet, there's additional costs incurred to do that from a site prep. Could we tie it to that additional cost?
That's exactly what is gonna be done, Commissioner.
But we can quantify that versus just give them a blanket TIF on the whole thing?
As I originally said, Mr. Commissioner, if that cost is less than the $247,000, that's what they would receive, is whatever that lesser amount is. If that cost is more than $247,000, they're only gonna get $247,000 because that's the increment that's available to them.
But somebody monitors that on the city staff?
I do.
Okay.
Well, I would make a recommendation, if we're done discussing, that we do approve the TIF as it's being recommended by staff.
I'll second.
Got a motion and a second, any discussion? Okay, I'm not seeing any discussion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
Nay.
Okay.
Do you need to call the House, or do you have it?
I have it. Thank you.
All right,
you.
that clears that. I believe that is everything that we were going to talk about today. There's only one item left on the agenda, and that is adjournment. Does anyone want to make a motion for adjournment?
I just want to, before we make an adjournment, thank you, Chris, for all the service you've done for Burnsville.
Well,
for the
thank
last
you.
6-7 years you've been on the commission.
Oh.
And then I'll make a motion to adjourn.
A second.
Okay, motion's been filed with compliments, I thank you. And seconded, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, have a great night.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you.